me start with a slightly uncomfortable question. If we can speak a language but we cannot read it, do we actually know that culture? Or do we only know the version of it that exists right now on the street, in our feet, and in our decade? Because I used to think language was mainly about communication. Can I order food? Can I make friends? Can I survive? But the more languages I learn, the more I realize. Speaking helps me function, but reading is what lets me time travel. And that's what this video is about. What language really is, and why reading quietly changes everything. And I'm saying this knowing that you might disagree. If you do, leave your take in the comments, because last time, your comments generally reshaped how I see this. In my last video, the topic sparked a lot of discussion, and it helped me see something clearly. People don't just learn languages differently. They also judge what language is for, based on their culture, their life, their needs. Some people learn a language and feel satisfied once they can speak and understand. But then communication is the goal. Other people learn a language because they want to read, because they want access to the deeper layer. For example, books, ideas, history, the way a civilization thinks. So today, I want to talk about two things: what language is, and why writing matters more than we think. At its most basic level, language is an external form of thought. You have an idea, and then your body turns it into sound, vibration, waves, and frequency. Those waves travel through the air, and another person receives them through their ears and decodes meaning. Spoken language is basically like this. You have a thought, your speech organs turn it into sound, and another person hears it. And humans don't technically need sound to communicate. We can communicate through gestures, facial expressions, and body language. It works. It's just expensive. It's slow, it's messy, and misunderstandings happen easily. I have seen this in my own family. My uncle's wife isn't from my hometown. My grandma doesn't speak Mandarin, she only speaks our local dialect. When my aunt first joined the family, she couldn't understand the dialect at all. So how did they communicate? They acted everything out. A lot of pointing, a lot of hand movements, a lot of, oh no, not this, not that, or this one, not that. And yes, misunderstandings happened all the time, but it was still better than no communication. So spoken language is efficient, and it's one reason humans can build societies. But here's where it gets interesting, because not all language becomes cultural. Something has to survive the speaker. If you have pets, you might notice something. Dogs and cats can understand a lot of what we mean. They react, they respond emotionally. They can learn routine, intentions, even moods, but they cannot speak the way humans do. Maybe it's their vocal system. Maybe it's the way their brains process language. There are many explanations, but for this video, I'm focusing on human language between humans. Because something special happens there. Humans don't just exchange information, humans build culture. And culture is built on inherited wisdom, things passed down across generations. For example, architecture, painting, sculpture, tools, traditions. But one of the most powerful inheritance systems is writing, because writing is memory that doesn't die. And once you notice that, you realize you are not just learning a language, you are choosing a time range. This is why I keep separating two things. Language is a tool to exchange thoughts in real time. Writing is what allows those thoughts to travel through time. A language can exist without writing. Many cultures have strong oral languages but no writing system. And in a way, my first language was like that too. My first language wasn't standard Chinese, it was a dialect. I grew up speaking it at home. But when I was 5 and started school, that's when I began learning Mandarin and writing Chinese characters. My grandma is a perfect example for this difference. She never went to school. She speaks perfectly in her word. But she cannot read. She has language. She simply doesn't have writing. So what do you lose when you only have spoken language? First, you get trapped in the present. If you learn a foreign language but only learn speaking and listening, your sources are almost always modern. People around you, online videos, podcasts, audio content. But audio recording is recent in human history. Mass broadcast is recent. The internet is very recent. So even when you hear a great thinker speaking today, you're only hearing a modern person summarizing what they read and processed. If you want direct access to older civilizations, older philosophy, older law, older history, you need text. Otherwise, you cannot cross time. Now, I want to be fair. Life is short. Speaking and listening alone is already a huge achievement. I'm not judging anyone. I'm just describing a structural limit. And I have seen how valuable oral knowledge can be. My grandma is a farmer. She has extremely practical farming knowledge. Real wisdom, built from experience. If tomorrow I stopped everything and went back to the countryside to farm, I honestly think I could become a good farmer because I grew up hearing those experiences. And yes, I could write those experiences down in Chinese characters and preserve them. But the dialect itself is fragile because once a dialect loses its usefulness, it disappears. And it disappears quietly. Here is a tiny example. My grandma has never had coffee. In her world, most people drink tea. So when I tried to explain coffee to her, I had to say something like, it's kind of like tea, just with a different taste. That's what happens when vocabulary is shaped only by daily survival. If a community doesn't need certain concepts, the language doesn't naturally grow in that direction. And if there is no writing, those new concepts don't get stored and stabilized easily. So an oral-only language doesn't just lose history. It can also struggle to expand when life changes. Second, a language without writing is much easier to disappear. Communities change, people move, economies shift. A language can lose use very quickly. This is how many indigenous languages vanished across the world. When communities disappear, language disappeared. Even languages with writing can be lost over time. Maya writing existed, ancient Egyptian writing existed, and yet so much was broken, incomplete, lost. And honestly, that makes me respect Chinese characters even more. They survived, and because they survived, we can still learn today. We can stand in a museum like the Louvre and look at something like the Code of Hammurabi and learn how ancient legal systems were built. We can look at the oracle inscriptions in China. It's fragments, incomplete lines, and still try to reconstruct what people thousands of years ago believed, worshipped, and valued. Writing gives cultural durability. It lets knowledge outlive individuals. And that changes what learning even means. Let me make this personal. One reason I learned French faster isn't only because I live in France, it's also because I can read and write. When I can read French, I can meet minds directly, not just through modern commentary. I can read Voltaire. I can read Victor Hugo. I don't have to rely only on YouTube videos where someone explains what Voltaire really means. I can form my own judgment, and that's a huge difference because reading reduces dependence on intermediaries, people who can be biased, people who can distort, people who can simplify for you. Text isn't perfect, but it creates a quieter space where you can build your own mind. And in the internet era, I think this matters even more. When fewer people read deeply, something happens. People become easier to steal. Because if you only live through hearing and speaking, you mostly live inside your current moment, inside your circle, inside people around you repeat. And then it becomes easier to confuse what I think with what I have heard 1,000 times. That's why reading is not only knowledge. Sometimes it's protection. If you don't read, you lose historical perspective. You lose the ability to zoom out and see patterns across centuries. And then people get trapped in small groups, small identities, small circles. They are defending group interest emotionally, sometimes impassively. So yes, reading doesn't automatically make someone wise, but it can reduce narrowness, it can reduce bias, it can even increase empathy, because you are exposed to many layers of human experience across time. This is also why I think speaking only cultural knowledge can be misleading. If you can speak Chinese but you cannot read Chinese, your understanding of Chinese culture comes mostly from what you hear and see in modern life. But the civilization is not one slice. Most people learn Chinese today for economic reasons, and that's not shameful at all. I learned English and French partly for the same reason too. They reach more people. If I speak them, more people can hear my voice, and I can access more cultures directly. But here is the point. China developed very fast in the last few decades. So if you learn Chinese through modern media or daily interactions, your image of China can become mostly recent China. If you were Marco Polo, the China you would say would be different. And even many young Chinese people today have never actually read classic texts like the Dao De Jing. They have heard of it, but they haven't read it. So if you only interact with young people, you might not touch the Asian civilization at all. If you interact with older people, you might miss it too, because history interrupted education for many. Some people didn't get the chance to study, like my grandma. Whenever my grandma sees me reading and writing, her eyes light up. She says, "If only I could read, how good that would be." That sentence stays with me because I have seen women who had intelligence but didn't have access because of time, space, circumstance. Annie Ernaux writes about something similar, how her mother loved her deeply, but life also felt unfair. Her mother worked with her hands endlessly, just so her daughter could go to school and read Plato. Part of my motivation comes from that kind of story, because reading is not just a skill. Sometimes it's the difference between being trapped inside your environment and having access to the world. My grandma can speak, she can understand, but because she cannot read, her information comes from people around her or from TV. So her world is limited by geography, by time, and by the people near her. But when you can read and write, something changes. Your peers are no longer only the people around you. Your peers can be Socrates or Einstein or any mind that left writing behind. You don't have to stay inside your environment. And that is a kind of freedom. And this also explains something bigger. Civilization develops because knowledge becomes transferable. Many languages disappear not because they are bad, but because there is no institutional support. There is no exchange demand. There is no production need. Language is tied to exchange and society. Even in China, Mandarin became widespread, partly because modern society needed efficiency, production, mobility, and industrial systems. Writing became a bridge for scientific and cultural transmission. Modern science books were translated, written down, and distributed. So even a student in a small town could learn something without teachers sitting in front of them explaining it. That's the power of text. You can inherit knowledge without needing someone to personally give it to you. You can access a mind you have never met. You can learn from people who lived centuries ago, and honestly, that still feels kind of unbelievable to me, in the best way. So this is what I wanted to share in this video. Spoken language is essential. It helps you live. But writing, reading, changes what a language can do. It gives you access to time, to history, to civilization, and to minds you will never meet. So I will end with two questions because I generally want your perspective. If you can speak a language but cannot read it, do you feel you truly know that culture? Or only its modern version? And do you think the decline of reading is just a tiny issue? Or do you think it changes people in a deeper way?